Okay, everybody, it's noon, so we're ready to get started. I want to start by saying that we will have sign interpreters, Jim Fenton and Jennifer Harvey Storrs, and they are going to be here. If you need to be really close to them, then we can arrange some chairs down here in front for you. So please feel free to arrange and come down. We would like to have you. It's a very beautiful audience. It's a wonderful day. Tell me, is it great to be a woman today? Yeah! Just to be fair, okay, just to be fair, do we appreciate the men in our lives? Yes! All right. Our format today, I want to tell you a little bit ahead of time about that. We're going to, after Angela Davis speaks, then we're going to have a question and answer session, and when you and she decide you're through with question and answers, I'm going to ask you to stay seated so that she can go back to a table back there where we at one point had some of her books for sale. They were all sold out. But if you brought a book, yeah, all right, good deal. If you brought a book of hers and you would like to have it signed, or if you have a program or just a piece of paper that you would like to have it signed, or if you would like to have a word with her, then she'll be back there at that table, and just give her a chance to get back there, okay? And I'll help you with that when we get finished. Welcome to the second keynote address of this year's Women's Week celebration. I am the chair of the Women's Week Planning Committee, and I am the director of the Marriott Library. My name is Sarah Mahalik. Our theme this year is Breaking Boundaries, Reconstructing Activism. Our goal was to demonstrate that activism assumes many forms, and that in Utah, as in other places, women are defining and redefining activism continuously and in changing ways. On Monday evening, Tish Hinojosa's music told an audience of nearly 1,500 of the strong, sweet spirit that must be shared between those who need help and those who serve. On Tuesday, our first keynote speaker, Wilma Mankiller, told an audience of over 400 about her growth from shy girlhood to strong womanhood, emerging finally into the leadership position of the Cherokee Nation, all through her determined, stubborn commitment to activism. Yesterday, Irene Fisher, director of the Bennion Center for Community Service here at the U, led 5 women from Salt Lake City in a panel conversation with an audience of over 100. Together, the audience and the panel built a definition of activism, and here are some of the things that came of that conversation. Activism is action. You've got to go out and try to do something. Activism concentrates on others. It is outside the self. The energy for activism often consists of redirected anger. Activism takes the long view and is patient. Activism is embodied in large deeds and also in small ones. Commitment to activism may cause great personal pain and the need to sacrifice the comfort of family and friends. Activism and power are intertwined, and the activist must use power with care. Activism may result in unintended negative consequences, but don't get discouraged, forge ahead. And lastly, the accomplishments of activism overshadow even great personal pain and disappointment and result in deep and lasting satisfaction. Here in the Union Gallery, curator Lance Duffin has created a reconstruction of activism through the visual arts. The inner beauty, the sadness, and the joy of the activist's life are portrayed vividly in Tracy Longley Cook's photographs of 25 highly accomplished Utah women. Go over there and see it when you have a chance. It's a very wonderful exhibit. Today's address is the climax of our celebration, and it is now my privilege to introduce the president of the University of Utah, who will introduce our keynote speaker. We are fortunate in our president, who is a visionary and values-centered leader. Among his core beliefs are that women are equal to any task confronted by our society, and that diversity strengthens any endeavor. Let me read from his recent address at Brigham Young University. When I consider the 21st century definition of an educated person, it is essentially gender-free. The roles women can play in this century are unlimited. Access to education is no longer tied to gender, and what makes a person educated has nothing to do with biology, unquote. A celebration of the accomplishment of women activists would be hollow if held outside the context of a diverse community and society. Let me quote President Machen from a later portion of the same speech. In order to be a truly educated person in the 21st century, one must embrace diversity and become a citizen of an increasingly global community. We must recognize and accept that people with profoundly different ideas and ways of life from our own, with profoundly different ideas, have ways of life different from our own. We must all learn to live and work with people who see the world through different prisms. And rather than be threatened, we can enrich our lives by celebrating such diversity, unquote. President Machen, thank you for your principled leadership and for your frequent and public articulation of the very values we seek to highlight and to understand in our Women's Week celebration. Would you please introduce our speaker?
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, everybody. What a great turnout today. I'm really excited to have this kind of turnout on a busy Thursday, isn't it? Yeah. 2 days before spring break. So, Angela, this is a great turnout. Everybody's either getting ready for midterms or putting on their suntan lotion and getting ready to go out of state. 2 months ago, I got a chance to introduce to this group one of my personal heroes, Morris Dees, at the Martin Luther King Day celebration. Today, it's my great honor to introduce another leader of my generation, someone that I have followed with great respect for many years. The theme of the conference this year for Women's Week is Breaking Boundaries, Reconstructing Activism. And I can't think of a person who better embodies those ideas than Angela Davis. For many, the name Angela Davis means activist. Professor Davis received national attention because of her activism in the late 60s. But she had always been politically active, even as a youngster in Birmingham, Alabama, and in high school in New York. By the time she was teaching philosophy at UCLA, she was still active, speaking out on behalf of black prisoners and joining the Communist Party. Those activities led to her removal from her teaching position. Davis was accused of complicity in a courtroom shooting and was placed on the FBI's most wanted list. She was later acquitted of all charges following a Free Angela Davis campaign that many of us still remember. Professor Davis has continued to speak, write, and organize for prisoners' rights. She is a member of the advisory board of the Prison Activist Resource Center, and she helped found a national organization called Critical Resistance. In addition, she has continued to speak and write provocatively and with an independent voice. Her books attest to her interest and convictions. They include Women, Race, and Class, Blues, Legacies, and Black Feminism, Gertrude Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, and Billie Holiday, Women, Culture, and Politics, and the Prison Industrial Complex on CD-ROM. As she once said in a PBS Frontline interview, I think the importance of doing activist work is that it allows you to give back and to consider yourself not as a single individual, but part of an ongoing historical movement. Former California Governor Ronald Reagan once vowed that Davis would never again teach in the University of California system. Today, she's a tenured professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, teaching in the History of Consciousness department. We're very happy that Professor Davis could be with us today. Please join me in welcoming Angela Davis. I think this works. Are you going to use this?
you. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, and good afternoon. Yeah, I realize I probably should be coming to Utah more frequently. You know, the landscape is not only absolutely exquisite, but your welcome has been warm. And, well, you know, people think about Utah in different terms. So. And I guess I'll begin by thanking the organizers of Women's Week for having invited me to give one of the two keynote addresses under the theme, Breaking Boundaries, Reconstructing Activism. And I am especially honored to have shared this opportunity with Wilma Mankiller. And she has been a woman who has inspired me for many years, as well as a personal friend. And I am only sorry that we could not have been here on the same day. How many of you attended her talk? Wonderful. This is International Women's Day. This is March 8th. And on the way to Salt Lake City from San Francisco this morning, I was reading our local newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicle. And I was surprised to see on the editorial page a short piece called International Women's Day. I mean, I've actually been celebrating International Women's Day since the 1960s. But this is how the editorial goes. Remind me again, he asked sheepishly, what is International Women's Day? Should I celebrate my wife today? Honor my female colleagues? Yes, do both, and read on. In March 1909, American working women fighting for a 10-hour day and suffrage, 10-hour day, right? 10-hour work day. And that was in 1909. It's very bizarre that we've gotten stuck on the 8-hour workday, isn't it? Because there should be campaigns against the 8-hour workday now. In March 1909, American working women fighting for a 10-hour workday and suffrage and to end sweatshops and child labor. Sounds familiar? First celebrated March 8th as International Women's Day. In 1922, Lenin declared it a national holiday in the Soviet Union. What started as an American working women's celebration soon became associated with communism. But in 1969, dozens of women activists in Berkeley resurrected the day in this country and dressed as turn-of-the-century female activists marched for women's rights. They took as their slogan, bread and roses, words that reflected their desire to be treated with respect and equality, both as workers and women. As the women's movement swept across the country in the 70s, it brought International Women's Day to hundreds of communities. In 1978, nearly all schools celebrated March 8th. I don't know whether, well, anyway. The struggle for working women's rights has not ended. What can you do? Right some wrongs, celebrate the work that all women do everywhere, every day. Now, I'm reading that because although there's some factual problems and the narrative isn't exactly the narrative that everyone tells about International Women's Day, it is interesting that finally we are able in this country to do something more than celebrate Mother's Day. And I'm wondering, though, how long it will be before the International Women's Day sales you know. Um, so I think it is especially important to circulate these stories and these narratives and talk about International Women's Day. It doesn't matter if you get a couple of the historical references wrong, but it is important to think about the historical tradition shaped by working women, and that we celebrate that tradition today. Now, I've been asked to talk about radical activism, or radical frameworks for feminist activism. And first of all, I think it's great to celebrate International Women's Day with this talk about radical activism in a place that has not always been known for its radical activism. Although I see that from the responses thus far today, there is a very rich terrain here in Salt Lake City when it comes to radical activism. But what do you think radical means? What is radicalism? Anybody?
Outside the mainstream.
Outside the mainstream? At what? Big change, not little change. But she just said what I wanted to say. And many of you are students, right? Okay, have you ever looked up the word radical? I mean, do you ever think about etymological meanings? Some of you may study mathematics. And have you ever heard the term radical used in mathematics? Well, anyway, what she said was that radical means root, at the roots. And it's true. A professor of mine many years ago, Herbert Marcuse, used to always insist that to be radical is to understand things not on the surface, not in the way they appear to be, not in accordance with the dictates of common sense, but to think deeply and look at the roots of whatever the problem you're considering may be. So I want to talk about radicalism in that context. And of course it does mean outside the mainstream, because not too many institutions within the main, of course it depends on how you define mainstream, are willing to do that kind of deep, critical thinking and engagement with a range of the social problems we confront today. So I want to begin by saying that, in my opinion, radicalism requires a basic understanding of, when we're talking about radical feminism or radical feminist frameworks or radical frameworks for feminist activism, I think that's the term we're using. It requires us to understand the way gender and race and sexuality and class mutually interact to create the institutional and ideological structures that shape our social realities. Now, some people may argue that we've achieved racial equality, although the last election made many people think differently about that. You know, some people may argue that we have achieved gender equality. After all, the pilot on my plane from San Francisco to Salt Lake City was a woman. And I'm always absolutely happy to see women. You know, some people say, do you think they can really pilot the plane? But I said, I feel much more comfortable. Well, anyway. But if we think about gender equality only in terms of formal access, it doesn't tell us that much about the kind of feminism I want to ask you to think about this afternoon. Because if one assumes that we can lay out a formal basis for gender equality, then it might also mean that women have the right to fight for the ability to equally engage in acts of oppression and domination, the equal opportunity to dominate and oppress. And of course, many of you know that I have been doing work around prison issues for a long time. As a matter of fact, if I have some time, I'll talk a little bit about my own activist history, but I ended up going to jail because I was doing work around prison questions. And 30 years later, I'm still doing that work, a different kind of work. But I've been very interested in the fact that increasingly, in many places, women are being proposed as wardens and others who participate in the prison hierarchy. As a matter of fact, there's an interesting book by a woman who was a warden of a prison in Michigan, as a matter of fact, by the name of Tekla Miller. And she wrote a book called The Warden Wore Pink. And one of the reasons I would criticize her approach to equality and her emphasis on a kind of formal equality as the defining feature of her own feminism, is that she ended up assuming what I would consider to be some contradictory positions. She ended up arguing that the measure of equality for women's prisons is the extent to which women prisoners are treated the same as men. And so that she fought for the right to have a larger arsenal at her prison, and fought for the right for women escapees to be treated with the same kind of repression as men. Women, at that particular time, women, if they tried to go over the wall, generally were not, well, they were warning shots fired first. Whereas with men, there were no warning shots fired. And so she argued that in order for the women's prison to be considered on a par with men's prisons, they had to use the same policy so that a woman escapee should not have the privilege of having a warning shot before she was actually targeted by the sharpshooter. That's kind of strange, don't you think? But anyway, I'm not going to go into that. I just wanted to give you an example of the pitfalls of equating feminism or radical feminism with the formal equality of women. So I want to urge you to think about a kind of feminism that subverts rather than reinforces existing structures of domination, of class domination, of racial domination. And of course, by now we know that we can't separate gender and treat it as something separate from class or sexuality or race. we've learned how to develop what we call intersectional frameworks, perspectives of intersectionality, right? Instead of arguing that race and class and gender and sexuality can be added and subtracted from the whole, we have to see them as you sort of entangled in an intersectional relation. And you can't pull one out of the structure. You can't say, what do you think is most problematic in your life, your gender or your race, right? I mean, people used to ask questions like that all the time. People used to ask me, well, do you feel more oppressed as a woman or as a black person? You know, as an unraced woman, as a race-neutral woman, and I don't know what that's supposed to feel like, you know, or as a genderless black person, and I don't know what that's supposed to feel like either. It took a while before we figured out how to answer that question, though. I mean, you see how part of our activist battle has been finding the right questions, discovering the right vocabulary, being able to ask the right questions, because if somebody asks you, you know, what is it, does it feel worse for you in terms of oppression to be a black person or a woman, and you start thinking, and you generally come up with some kind of answer that doesn't make any sense at all. But the problem is you don't know it doesn't make any sense, because you don't realize that the question itself is flawed fundamentally. But that's a part of struggle. That's a part of achieving certain victories in the field of what one might call ideology, consciousness, but also winning victories in the material world. What we discover is that each time we are able to win a victory, a new terrain is created so that we can ask new questions. And then we also are able to think about the past in a different way. We're also able to ask different questions about the past. Now, I've always thought that it is extremely important to identify with and take up the causes of those women and those men who are most marginalized, most invisible. There was a time when I couldn't explain why I felt that way. And there was also a time later, after we developed the discussion about the relationship between women of color and the women's liberation movement in the late 60s and the early 70s, when we began to develop this way of thinking about the relationship between fighting with and on behalf of those who are most oppressed or most marginalized, we began to talk about the fact that it is possible for, say, a woman who is, I'm giving you some examples, who has been shut out of the boardroom of the corporation on the grounds of sexism. It is possible to fight for her to have the right to become a member of a board of directions of one of the Fortune 500, and that will be a victory, of course. But who benefits from that victory? You know, what about the women who are the targets of the exploitation of that corporation? What about the women who clean the houses for the women who have these wonderful careers. But on the other hand, if you think about fighting on behalf of poor women and working class women, and when you think about the way in which the victories we win in those struggles tends to push the whole structure upwards, so that, you know, what I'm arguing against is the trickle-down theory. And, you know, maybe we can develop another term for the, what would you suggest? Well, it's not trickle up, because it's like this real push. And the point that, think about it, maybe during the question and answer, somebody will have a good phrase for that. But the point I'm making is that it is possible to leave large numbers of people behind. And one of the problems in the last years, particularly as the economy has at least been represented as moving forward, although we're having some serious problems right now, we see, you know, and I don't know whether I'm going to talk about our newly selected president or not, but anyway, we'll see what he does. But, you know, the point that I'm making is that there are vast numbers of women and men who are not even on the unemployment list because they have been looking for work so long that they have given up, and therefore they are rendered invisible. They're not even counted anymore unless they're actively looking. What about the women who no longer are able to count on welfare and have to rely, if they can find work at all, have to rely on minimum wage work at places like McDonald's and whatever, and those companies don't pay them enough even to cover the cost of child care, or to even cover the cost of working, transportation, lunch, you know, all of that. And what about women in prison? As I said before, I've been working around issues of imprisonment for so long, it feels like somehow or another somebody decided that this was going to be my life's work. And now I realize that that must have been the reason I ended up going to jail. It didn't seem like that then, of course, particularly when I was on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list and was charged with 3 capital crimes. I have a personal connection with the campaign against the death penalty today as well. But I realized when I went to jail myself that I had been doing all of this work around political prisoners and prison issues, and had not even been thinking about women. So going to jail helped me think about what it meant to focus this work, this prison activism, around women. And now, of course, that we find ourselves in the midst of the emergence of this vast prison industrial complex, these questions about the reasons why women go to prison at an ever greater rate are more urgent than ever before. Women constitute the fastest growing sector of the imprisoned population in this country. Black women are 8 times more likely than white women to go to prison. Latina women are 4 times more likely. So you're talking about women of color. And we know that almost 70% of the population of the jails and prisons in this country, 2 million people, 2 million people behind bars. Think about that, 2 million people behind bars. And almost 70% consists of people of color. And somebody's making a lot of money as a result of this huge imprisoned population. Corporations are, provide the goods and services. They develop the prison design plans. They construct the prison. So you have architecture and construction firms and firms that produce almost anything that you can imagine that are connected with this prison industrial complex. And telephone companies that collect telephone calls for prisoners that are making an enormous amount of money, MCI, for example. And then you have those corporations that use prison labor directly or indirectly, and I can name some of them. I can name TWA that is known to have used prisoners to do reservations, plane reservations, yeah? And Victoria's Secret, and Microsoft, and Starbucks, and I could go on. Eddie Bauer. The point that I'm making is that the prison expansion affects us. It's not just about those who are unfortunate enough to be caught in this web of profitable punishment. And the point is that there are many people in prison who are there because they just made a mistake. We tend to think about the imprisoned population as a population of murderers and rapists and of people who are so morally distinct from the rest of us that we can indeed put them away in a place where they are warehoused and a place where which makes it possible for us no longer to have to think about them. Because prison is a concept also into which we deposit those problems that we don't want to have to think about and deal with. The vast majority of women in prison are in on nonviolent charges, on charges related to drugs. And there are reasons why so many people do drugs in this society. And I'm not only talking about the illicit drugs, because I find it absolutely ironic that you can turn on television and see an ad that says, if you have social anxiety, ask your doctor about Paxil. You know? And then there are poor people who don't have a doctor they can ask about Paxil. But there's a whole range of other drugs, street drugs, accessible to them. So, many women are self-medicating. They're trying to feel better, and they end up getting punished as a result of it. Dorothy Gaines, Kimber Smith were facing almost their entire lives in prison. Fortunately, President Clinton pardoned them. And they were in on drug charges, but drug charges related to the men they were involved with. And there's another whole group of women who are in prison, particularly federal prisons, because they have the misfortune of being involved with men who are connected with drug trafficking. And usually the men either get out or do very short sentences because they can turn over information. Because they have information. The women who don't know anything about the drug trade don't have anything to offer, and they end up getting a sentence of 25 to 30 years. Go into any federal prison. You will find that story being told over and over again. Kimber Smith, Dorothy Gaines, who were just recently released when Clinton, those were some good pardons he made. And, since there's all this controversy about Mark Rich, I want to know, why didn't he just pardon Leonard Peltier? If he had pardoned Leonard Peltier, of course there would have been the controversy, but there would have been support, not only all over the country, but all over the world. And it could have changed his reputation. his historical reputation. But anyway, we're still fighting for the freedom of Leonard Peltier and Mumia Abu-Jamal. And finally, let me say, because we do want to, what time is it now? Okay, so I have a few more minutes. All right, there are two other things I want to talk about then. Okay, one is the way in which activism around prison issues can help us to make connections with issues, particularly global issues. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One has to do with the fact that women's prisons are, women's prisons in other countries follow the model of the U.S. prison. Well, the prison historically was America's gift to the world. The penitentiary is an American, a United States invention, and it emerges with the emergence of political democracy and is inextricably linked to democracy. As a matter of fact, I always say that the prison is the quintessential democratic institution. That is because the prison deprives you precisely of those rights that democracy gives to you. And if you don't have the rights, then you can't conceive of a punishment in which those rights will be taken away. I mean, this is one reason why we have to think about the prison as an important institution of U.S. democracy. And of course, now prisons exist all over the world. And we take prisons for granted. We assume that prisons have always been here, and they always will be here. That is the only way you can address issues of crime. And I want to suggest that the prison was a historical invention. And if it was invented historically, we could also think about other forms of punishment, other ways of addressing these issues. But for the time being, as we've seen since the beginning of the 19th century, the penitentiary traveled throughout the world, into the colonies through European involvement in third world areas as well. Now we're seeing new models of imprisonment travel along the circuits of globalization. One is the super maximum security prison, a relatively recent invention that can be traced back to 1983, when the Marion Federal Prison locked down permanently and became a model for a new form of imprisonment, ironically recapitulating the early era of the penitentiary when people were forced to do their time in solitary confinement, in permanent solitary confinement. But then there are other ways in which these, the circuits of globalization allow the prison to travel. There's private prison companies. Corrections Corporation of America is the largest private prison company in the world. And until just a couple of months ago, Corrections Corporation of America, headquartered in Nashville, Tennessee, owned and operated the largest women's prison in Australia. Think about that. In Melbourne. Fortunately, a prison activist group, a feminist group in Australia, has been putting pressure on the Australian government to the extent that it finally agreed to withdraw the contract from Corrections Corporation of America. No, but then there are also the connections with immigration that we need to think about. The fact that so many people who are in prison, so many women who are in prison, are in as a result of being under the auspices of the Immigration Naturalization Services, the INS. And that the INS now is the largest federal armed body. The INS has more armed agents than the FBI, has more armed agents than the customs people, more armed agents than the, what is it called, the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Can you believe that? And in connection with the prison industrial complex, you have these detention centers that are expanding for people whose only crime is that they have no documents. And oftentimes they have no documents because U.S. corporations have wrought havoc on their home economies and have created situations where they can no longer live at home and are compelled to immigrate here. So what is the future of democracy? I want to submit that we cannot consider the future of democracy without recognizing the threat that is posed by the prison industrial complex. I was speaking about our newly selected president. You may have followed the controversy surrounding the voting rights violations in Florida. As a matter of fact, many people have been saying that the election was stolen. Well, I don't know what you all think here in Utah, but I do know that you recognize that there were some serious problems that permanently affected the reputation of this country throughout the world. And I would just like you to think about the fact that 400,000 black men in Florida could not vote, either because they are in prison or because they have been in prison. And Florida is one of those states that permanently disenfranchises anyone who has been in prison, regardless of what the charges may have been. So, you see, I mean, even if those guys alone had been able to vote, the outcome wouldn't have been so murky as it appeared to be. But that's another talk. And I would like to have a conversation with you, brief conversation, before we conclude this gathering. I want to end by saying that activism is not something that you can define with bullet points. It's not something that you can define in accordance with the site of your activism. It's not something you can define according to the duties that you are called upon to perform as an activist. I always suggest that we define activism as broadly as possible. And one such broad definition would be doing work that makes a difference in the world. And you can do that wherever you are. You know, some people like organizations, and they like meetings that last until 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. You know, they like to get out there and pass out all of the leaflets. You know, some people do not like to do that. And unfortunately, there have been those who have created this kind of paragon of activism, who argue to other people, if you don't come to this meeting, then you're not an authentic activist. But activists can do their work that makes a difference as artists, as poets, as musicians, as teachers, as students who urge their peers to think more deeply, to think more radically, to think more critically. And that is what I believe will ultimately lead to lasting change. Thank you very much. I think there's the microphones. And what, we have like about 10 or 15 minutes or so?
Yeah, we have 15 minutes.
15 minutes for questions. Oh, okay. You know, we need...
What are the defining moments of your life?
Oh. You know, that's something that's, I don't know whether there are any defining moments because they're always changing. And I always look back and see different moments and think about them in different ways. And I mean, this is one of the reasons why I was saying that it's really important to have as broad a conception of activism as possible. Because we all change, we develop, we grow. I mean, I'm, wow, how long have I been, okay, if you say that I started as an activist at around 10 years old, 9 or 10 years old, and I'm 57 now, so that means I've been doing it almost 50 years. And it's not been boring. It's not been boring because, you know, it's always different. And I see activism primarily as a way to live my life, not as something that I can decide to do or not do. I just would not feel comfortable if I did not share some of my knowledge and some of my energy with those people in the world whom I consider my allies. And, you know, growing up in the segregated South meant a lot because I have seen many changes occur. And I think those changes have to continue to happen. I can't imagine a moment when I can think about us ever having won, you know, all of the victories that we can imagine. So, she had her hand up first.
I do want to thank you for coming and speaking and being an activist. I would like to, a prison reform activist, invite any of you and all of you to some of the meetings here locally. I'm on the board of Families Against Mandatory Minimums here in Utah. And we meet the second Tuesday of each month at the East Mill Creek Library at 7 p.m. And I'm also on the board of Citizens for Penal Reform, CPR, and we meet the third Thursday in the Cannon Room, room 335 at the City and County Building. So these are just a couple of organizations that are local here that are
And FAM is national.
FAM is national. We're the local chapter here, and it's so important to get involved.
Absolutely.
My question to you is, do you know of any groups or organizations that promote support systems for children with incarcerated parents?
You know, actually I do. A friend of mine in the Bay Area, whose name is Ida McCrae, who was in the federal prison for quite a number of years, got out about 5 years ago. She established an organization called Families with a Future. And one of the things she does is she goes into the high schools and works with children whose parents are in prison. And her children assist her with that work because they found themselves totally isolated and ashamed and unable to talk to people about her situation when she was in prison. So if you'd like to get in touch with her, I can tell you how to reach her.
Here's a lady right here who has been trying.
Angela, Utah is one of only 3 states that doesn't have a hate crime bill. Our legislation, this legislative session didn't pass. The governor's going to have a special session around another issue. And if you get an opportunity to speak to the press, we'd like you to encourage the governor to look at this issue again. We're having people from all over the world for the Olympics come in next year. And even if we weren't, we need this bill passed.
Well, you know, maybe you could get a resolution from this gathering, and I would be happy to sign it.
Okay. If everyone here could call the governor and ask him to look at this issue and the special session.
Absolutely. Okay. Is there only one microphone?
Here too.
Oh, okay.
I just sent her over there because that lady had been trying.
Okay.
I'm curious as to if and how your view of communism has changed over the years.
Well, I was a member of the Communist Party for many years. I'm no longer a member of the Communist Party, but I am a member of an organization that is socialist, communist, and the name of that organization is Committees of Correspondence. Connecting with the American Revolution, you remember the Committees of Correspondence? Oh, read your history books. Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism. And I believe that capitalism is responsible for so much of what is wrong about this society and the world. And, you know, as a matter of fact, now that there are no socialist countries, well, Cuba is still, trying to survive as a socialist country. It is even more important to develop ways of criticizing and opposing the insinuation of capitalist ideologies into our lives. You know, most people take capitalism for granted now. And even if you look at something like hip-hop, a friend of mine did a paper recently in which she talked about the irony that hip-hop, which is supposed to be this subversive form, cultural form, actually draws upon the figure of the capitalist, and promotes the notion that what we all need to do basically is to earn money for ourselves. And there's something strange about the way in which the values of capitalism have become the values of democracy. You know, I believe very deeply in the values of democracy, and I think we need to unhook them, unlink them, disarticulate them from capitalism. Oh, let's use that other microphone.
You talk about prisons and correctional facilities. I was wondering if you feel at all they're beneficial to people locked down, mental hospitals, things like that. If you feel like they help people, or if you feel like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Do I feel that the prisons are helpful and the mental institutions? Well, I think that there is something fundamentally flawed about the assumption that you can lock people up and then expect them to become rehabilitated. You know? I mean, I'm not suggesting that there aren't some people who may need to be separated from society, but you can't argue that separation, that segregation, is the way in which you're going to deal with every issue that is deemed a crime. And one thing I might point out is that there's this really important movement around the humane treatment of animals. I should say of animals other than humans, right? But we don't see the same kinds of ideas being used to challenge such institutions as, repressive mental institutions and prisons. I think that, well, I'm an abolitionist. Okay, that's what, some of us call ourselves abolitionists because we believe in death penalty abolitionism, but also we believe in prison abolitionism. And when we say prison abolitionism, everybody thinks about, we're going to open up all of the prison cells and let all of the criminals in. But that's not what it's about. It's about envisioning other kinds of institutions. It's about thinking about other ways of addressing those problems that lead people to prison. And it is, I mentioned the abolition of welfare. You know, why abolish welfare when there is no support system for poor women? You know, why not understand the relationship between the deindustrialization of the economy and the unavailability of jobs for many people, many communities, and at the same time, the entrance of drugs into those communities? New economies, illegal economies develop, which many people get involved in because they don't have the opportunity to find jobs anywhere else. And of course, there are all of these trajectories that end up in prison. You know, why can't some of these trajectories end up in a place that is productive? Why not more prisons instead of, why not more schools instead of more prisons? That slip was actually, that slip actually is indicative of the fact that many schools are more like prisons than they are like schools. So.
Richard, back.
Hello, my name is Nakia Whitaker. I'm a first-year law student at the U, and we had a death penalty